Well, hello and welcome back to the fourth year of the Technology, Risk-Taking, and Gambling webinar series. We're glad to have you back, whether you're watching live now or whether you're watching later on the recording. If you are watching live, as always, we welcome you to funnel in any questions or comments that you may have. But I am Kahlil Philander, and together with Sally Gainsbury, we are the hosts of this webinar series. Where we explore all aspects of technology, risk, and gambling on a regular basis with some of the finest guests that we have to offer. And this week, we have a very, very interesting guest. And to introduce her, I will pass on the conversation to my co-host, Sally Gainsbury.
Thanks, Kahlil. So I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm professor in the School of Psychology, and I'm the director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney. I'm also leader of the Technology Addiction Team in the Brain and Mind Centre, who are hosting this webinar series. So a big thanks to the Brain and Mind Centre. I'm very pleased to be able to have our guest today, which is Peter Murphy, MP, who is a federal member for Dunkley, and importantly, the chair of the Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs for the Australian Labor Party. So our last webinar we had was on the reports. We were looking at online gambling harm in Australia, and there were 31 recommendations made by the committee led by Peter Murphy, which consulted with many, many different stakeholders from all aspects, looking at what were the harms associated with gambling, particularly in its online. And it was really broad reaching from gaming to, wagering. There were a lot of recommendations made around marketing in particular. So we're really pleased to look into this and to find out about the process and background, because to my view, this is really the most significant inquiry that's focused specifically on gambling harms in Australia. So Peter, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit around the background of how this came to be, how you've seen community views and political views shift around online gambling, and what do you think led to allow this inquiry to take place?
Thank you, Sally and Kahlil. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity. And I'm also conscious that I'm talking with and to a bunch of actual experts, as opposed to the parliamentarian who looks at issues and wants the help from experts to try to resolve them. So as you said, I'm the chair of the House of Reps Standing Committee into Social Policy and Legal Affairs. And I was appointed that after the election in May of last year, when my side of politics, the Labor Party, or I guess we're sort of vaguely like the Democrats, Kahlil, got into government. So I'm a member of the government. And thinking about what I would like the committee to look at, really the first thing that sprang to mind was online gambling, and particularly for me, sports betting. And you asked about sort of community and political views. I think you can't talk to a member of parliament about what their community complain about without the ads for online gambling that are all over our television and our social media being on the list of things that people raise with them. And my personal background is very involved in sport in all different capacities, and I spend a lot of time with sporting clubs in my electorate, and the people who are concerned about it are parents, and also, to be honest, the people who have been targeting for the gambling, young men who are playing sport. And, it's the work of people like you who also have made it abundantly clear that there are social, financial, and ethical harm caused by that industry. So really, to give you an idea of how the sausage is made, I had a conversation with the Minister for Social Services, and so I'm really interested in having a proper look at what's going on with online gambling, sports betting and harm. And she's a bit more clear, I think, to the younger generation than me. She said, well, there's also this issue with loot boxes, to which I said, what is a loot box? And online gaming. And I want you to look at that as well. So what happens then is the committee meets, discusses what we're interested in, and the minister gives the committee a referral into what she would like us to hire into a timeline, terms of reference, and we got the reference into online and gaming.
Thank you for giving us that overview, particularly for someone like me based in America that, you know, is a little naive to different political systems sometimes.
Yeah. Kahlil, we currently have a Speaker of the House of Representatives in Australia, by the way.
Yes. Well, I'm actually Canadian, and I just live in America now, and we actually just got rid of our Speaker. So not a great story that we need to broadcast right now. But that aside, one of the things that I found very interesting in reading the report was the diversity of stakeholders who provided feedback within the context of this committee and the report that ultimately got written. I found this very different than sort of the American model, which is everybody kind of has to hire their own lobbyists. And if you don't hire your own lobbyists, then your views don't get integrated into the sausage being made, as you described. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind articulating whether that's kind of a common process, or was that something that was very specific that your group wanted to pursue in how they developed these recommendations?
Great question. On one level, it's a common practice. Our inquiries, and we have Senate inquiries, House inquiries, and joint inquiries. There's a lot of emphasis on making sure stakeholders get to participate. And whilst we have lobbyists, and there's a bit of a concern about the impact of lobbyists on our democracy, it is absolutely nothing like the experience of North America. And there's a lot of emphasis on our committee's right to stakeholders and invite them to participate. So I don't think I'm telling you anything that I can't talk about in private meetings, but at the start of an inquiry, the committee members will sit around with the secretariat and say, okay, what sort of groups, or in particular, which groups do we want to invite to participate in this inquiry? And come up with a list, and the secretary invites each of them to participate. Then there's a second level, and it applies across the board for inquiries, but I think it's much more front of mind when we're inquiring into social policy, perhaps type issues. We want to hear from people with experience. And this committee in particular, we were very clear with the Secretariat and some of the organisations that represent people or work with people who have had been involved in gambling. We want to hear the experience of people who had gambling harm, what the impact was on them, but also what their relationship was with the wagering service providers online. So again, actual effort is made to reach out and to, when the terms of reference are put out, and it's to say, we want to hear from you. And the members of Parliament that are on the committee put in effort in their communities, in their electorates, to find if there's anyone. And we also, I know on my side at least, we talk with our caucus and say, look, we've got this inquiry into online sports betting. If you've got anyone in your electorate that you've been dealing with, or any organisation that's been keen, you know, encourage them to make a submission. And then we sit with the secretary after submissions have been made. And as the chair, I do this, other members can contribute and say, okay, who should we call to give evidence now? You know, which stakeholders or individuals do we think their submissions could be enhanced, or what they've got to say is so powerful, we'd like them to give oral evidence.
And the inquiry, Kahlil, you may not be aware, was actually the people who wrote submissions. They were all made publicly available, but then the actual testimony was all live as well and recorded, so you could watch. And probably my favorite moment of the viewing was, Peter, your exchange with the CEO of Sportsbet, Barney Evans, where you repeatedly asked him the same question, and he repeatedly answered the question in a roundabout manner. So that was super fun. You can check that out on YouTube or Twitter. I'm sure that clip's made the rounds. But my question is for you, Peter, is how do you and actually it was really good. You kept literally asking the same question. So what I'm trying to get at is, how do you take all the views expressed from different perspectives, obviously with different bias, which is whether from a pro or anti, because advocates are biased in their own way. Everyone has their different objectives they're trying to put across. So how does the committee take on all that feedback and try and reconcile the different responses to the same kind of evidence or facts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And can I say that particular line of questioning, accidentally, that was the first time, and I suspect the last time, that I became a viral social media sensation. It was quite the experience. And interestingly, sorry, this is just a tangent. But interestingly, because what I was asking the CEO of Sportsbet about was essentially the practice of, if people lose, they're encouraged to bet more, but if people win, they're either blocked from using any of the inducements, which smart people who are good at maths can do arbitrage and other things to win with, or sometimes they're just stopped from betting at all. And I was really just trying to draw out the nature of an industry where loss is encouraged and success is stopped. But he wouldn't acknowledge that people who bet successfully are stopped from betting, even though it's absolutely clear that occurs. So I became actually a bit of a pin-up girl for punters for a while, because there's quite a community out there of people who have been stopped from betting because they've been successful. And it wasn't really something I was trying to do, but anyway, it was quite the experience. How do we reconcile all the evidence? It's like being a student or an academic, or really any field of work where you have to bring critical mind to it. I mean, very luckily, we've got a secretariat of amazing, smart, hardworking people who assist with collating all of the evidence. And it's really a matter of identifying clearly the themes that come through, placing the oral evidence and the written evidence sort of under those themes, and then saying, well, what are the crunch points where stakeholders disagree? Is there enough evidence to come to a conclusion about who's right and who's wrong? Or is it simply a matter of saying, look, there's an issue here that needs to be looked at? I tend to take a conservative view and say, look, if there's not an overwhelming evidence, preferably scientific or academic, like rigorous evidence, rather than just anecdotal evidence to come to a conclusion, then I'd prefer to say there's an issue here that needs to be looked at further. But if there's an overwhelming, it's a bit like climate change, really. If there's 100 scientists and 99 of them say one thing and one of them says another, I'm going to go with 99.
As you were going through this, did you feel like weighing the evidence on the gambling research side, was there anything that you found that was quite limited, where you thought that you would be able to get a better answer to something that you just couldn't? Or did it feel like you had most of the information you needed to make a good policy decision?
That's really interesting. I can answer it this way. I was surprised by the number of researchers who said there needs to be more research, which I think okay, it's obviously researchers want more research all the time because that's what you do. But it was less, look, I've done the research and I know the answer and it is black and white and here it is. It was more, I thought, a very encouraging acknowledgement that there are gaps in knowledge and there is, it's a field where not enough has been done and more needs to be done. And rather than feel disheartened necessarily by that, I was encouraged by the thought that people who, and you're right, Sally, everyone has biases, and when you hear the researchers over and over again talking about the harms of the industry, you can either say, like I did, 99 out of 100, I'm going to believe them, or you can start to be concerned that there's a bias and not looking at both sides. But I also think when the researchers also say, but here's an area that we want to do more on, there's not enough population-based research. We don't know yet really causal or correlation between loot boxes and young people gambling and harms, although Sally's had some research recently which goes closer to answering that, I think. I find that honesty about gaps in the research to be reassuring. If it comes with a, we want to do more.
Yeah, it's interesting because we always write our papers and the last sentence of every paper is, but more research is needed in this area. So it's probably not a surprise that was a common emerging theme that you found.
Yeah, and it's certainly something as a researcher I do cringe myself when I try to avoid saying that, but it is the case that we don't have all the answers. And some of that is in Australia, we are we certainly were leading the world at one point in terms of gambling research, and we do punch above our weight in terms of research on this topic, but there has been a lack of funding for it. And there's different approaches, as you say, whether it's population prevalence studies or experimental work. But I guess the difficulty around gambling research is that it is difficult to evaluate, unlike tobacco or alcohol or another substance, unless we actually can do it in situ, because it's difficult to try to encourage people to just imagine you're playing for real money. So there is this reliance on cooperation with the regulators to get approval for a policy to test, or with the gambling industry to allow permission to test and trial. It is important to have independent researchers do these trials. I was at a conference in Scandinavia last week where the industry were doing lots of trials and sharing them publicly. That hasn't tended to happen in Australia. So I was wondering, with there is a real focus on evidence-based policy, but with all these evidence gaps, was there any consideration of specific mechanisms through which would be best practice to gather more evidence, or if we just need to put policy in place and then evaluate it, because we don't want the evidence gaps to be a barrier either?
Yeah, there was a recommendation about needing a national clearinghouse at the very least, somewhere where people can go to say, here is the current research or the best studies. We had, and it's in the report, but we had a bit of discussion on the committee about that ethical issue and the potential conflict of gambling research needing to have data that's held by industry, but how compromised is research when it is either sponsored by or commissioned by the gambling industry. And that came up a bit when the gambling industry representatives and other organisations that rely on advertising money and revenue from gambling would often say, if you bring in X reform, it's going to lead to more people using illegal offshore gambling websites. Or, if you bring in Y reform, it's going to lead to people going and using overseas betting and where we can't regulate them. And there was a real absence of evidence about, is that really going to happen? And the only studies we got were commissioned directly by the gambling industry, purporting to say what had happened in the UK when regulations were tightened up, which didn't sit particularly well with some of the research that came out from the UK government. So the inclination sort of is to say, well, we'll just discard that research because it was commissioned by the gambling industry. But is it biased necessarily, or were the people who were commissioned to do it strictly independent? And, you know, there's an issue in Australia about universities taking sponsorship from gambling industries. So we didn't say that there shouldn't be collaboration with industry, because I think that's a bit naive, as you pointed out. Like, you need in situ, we need the data. We did say there's a bit of a role for government in facilitating or mandating de-identified data being provided by gambling companies to researchers and academics. And there's probably a role for the government to invest more in research so that universities and academics don't have to consider that ethical issue of taking sponsorship or collaborating directly with industry.
Yes, thank you for sharing your views on that. It's a question that we ask ourselves a lot as gambling researchers, and we're all in different circumstances as well. So, you know, Sally obviously is in a psychology department. I'm actually in a business school, and so, you know, part of my incentive structure is that I actually should be working with industry more often, even if I'm studying, you know, these types of responsible gambling related questions. It's a interesting thing to think about, but, you know, I'm always of the mind that as long as we are disclosing where the funding might be coming from or how the project was structured and what firewalls in place, then people like you who are mindful of potential conflicts and biases can choose to just throw it out if you want to do so. But of course, I'm sure everybody's in favor of the government's, you know, putting more money into our research as well. That's always a great thing that we'll have a hard time saying no to. I wanted to ask you a question that, you know, that we have someone who's so invested in policy, but not just gambling policy. And you have to have, you know, a mindful look at things that extend beyond just the scope of what we might look at. And one of the things that often emerges when we do our research is that we might do some sort of study and we'll say, well, we've discovered that, you know, this product or this circumstance causes gambling harm, therefore it should be stopped or it should be constrained or regulated in some very specific way. But that's, of course, a very narrow view at a very specific issue that doesn't think about, well, how does this fit into the overall society and the rules around, you know, people's freedoms and their ability to choose for themselves. And so we have the fortunate ability to have a very narrow conversation about these topics. But when you make policy decisions, you have to be a bit more mindful for how this might impact individuals in other ways or society in other ways. How much of that makes its way into your decision making here in these sets of recommendations? And I'm just curious if you could take us through the way that you and perhaps some other committee members try to weigh those different things as you approach these sort of important issues.
Thank you, because that is something actually often that advocates don't acknowledge, that things are often more complicated than one specific point of view sees them to be. Sometimes inevitably, sometimes by design of industry or civic society. So, you know, with sports betting, you know, one of the complications is that sports betting companies in Australia, and I know that it's now starting to happen in America too, put in significant effort and have now embedded themselves in major football codes, and has led to those codes feeling like if they didn't have the revenue from sports betting, they might not be able to do some of the things that they do in communities and with clubs. Put aside whether I think that's a valid argument or not, you can't not consider the fact that the major sporting codes are saying if you do X, Y, and Z, we won't be able to deliver community sport or have the elite sports programs that are essential to our code. You just can't ignore that, but you've got to put effort into sort of teasing out the validity of that argument. And then there is, I think, an ethical or an ideological flex point that you have to reach. So this is me personally. I reached the point where, well, in the end, if the major sporting codes, if I think that they are reliant on money from an industry which is causing significant harm or whose business model is about helping vulnerable people to lose money, then my decision is they shouldn't be reliant on that money and they need to find another way to do it. But other people might reach a different ideological or moral or ethical flex point. One of the really interesting things, and I think something that I'm quite proud of about my committee, is that because it's a House of Representatives committee, it's a parliamentary committee, so it's made up of members of the government, the Labor Party, which I'm a part of, members of the Liberal Party, which for viewers who aren't from Australia is our Conservative or Tory party, members of the National Party, which notionally at least represent people from the country and in the regions who are in coalition with the Liberal Party, and independent member of Parliament. So cross-party represented with different ideological views. You know, the importance of freedom of choice and individual decision-making, very important for Liberal National Party members. Labor Party a bit more about the collective. It was everyone signed up to this report and these recommendations. It was a cross-party report, which I think speaks volumes about the way the evidence affected everyone about the harms and the need to address them.
And that's a really interesting and important approach to take. And thank you for spelling out the background for our international viewers. The other issue that is really interesting about the recommendations is that because it wasn't a government policy paper, they were recommendations that were fairly high level and obviously didn't have to get into the details, the how. So I was wondering how much that was taken into consideration when making the recommendations around feasibility and, you know, acceptance or uptake or implementation issues at all.
Yeah, thank you. That one of the beauties is that you don't have to implement them, the recommendations. So you can somewhat just go, yeah, I know there's speed humps on this road, but we have to go down the road. But we did try very hard to make recommendations that might be challenging to implement, but were implementable, because I think there's no point making recommendations to government that are, you know, the sort of thing that you might put in a master's thesis or something, which is, you know, in the ideal world, this is what you would do, because we're not in the ideal world. We're in the business of politics and government. So a good example is we said that advertising, ads on television, radio, and social media for online gambling should be banned, which is one of the big hot ticket issues in Australia. But we were conscious that it's not that simple. So like I was talking about, sporting groups, particularly the Australian Football League, gets a lot of money out of its sponsorship, and actually gets essentially a commission for the number of bets that are put on that can be related to the ads during their games. Sporting organisations have contracts. Governments have contracts with big events that might have sponsorship from gambling, all sorts of things like that. That our free-to-air television here said that they rely on the advertising revenue very much. So we said recommendations, it should be done, knowledge it would need to be stepped through. And here's what we think the government might be able to do initially, May 12-month period. Here's what we think we understand would take longer, with the aim that a full ban come in within 3 years. But we also said in the report, but we're conscious that even a 3-year period may have hurdles that mean in exceptional circumstances it needs to be longer than 3 years. Commercial contracts, for example. When Australia banned tobacco sponsorship and advertising in sport, it was a pretty long process because it involved having to negotiate international tournaments and international events like Commonwealth Games and Olympics as well. So we were conscious of that. So we want to back away from the ultimate, we think that ads should be banned, but we tried to be very conscious that it's much more complicated than simply saying, okay, tomorrow we're bringing in legislation to ban ads. We don't have the detail of everything, but here's a roadmap of the way we think we can get there.
Just on that topic of advertising, I've had lots of conversations, obviously, since this report, and the advertising at a population level for that broadcast advertising is obviously critical, but the direct marketing, the emails that go out to people directly, that's, shown by evidence to be more effective. It's obviously more personalized, it's more timely. Was there any consideration on direct marketing?
Yeah, so we said that it's not direct marketing, but targeted marketing. We actually think that there's no reason why targeted marketing or marketing on social media shouldn't just be banned immediately. Mainly, again, because it's a bit more practical. It's Meta and whatever Elon Musk is calling Twitter these days, and Google, really, who are the stakeholders, which doesn't have quite the same complication as Australia's sporting codes, free-to-air TV networks, and businesses based in Australia for implementing a ban on them. Should be easier. We said that inducements, which are what are often sent by email, bet $50 and we'll match it, or bet $500 and we'll match it, or you've got $1,000 free bets, whatever, all those variations. We said that should be banned. And again, we just said that should be banned immediately. We heard a lot of evidence from people who had gambled away everything they owned and lost relationships and so forth, about the insidious nature of those inducements and the targeted advertising to them, even after they used functions like take a break for 3 months. And as soon as the day the 3 months was over, they were receiving targeted marketing to come back and gamble. And that was overwhelmingly convincing that sort of targeted marketing of inducements should stop.
I'm curious, as you talk more, I wonder, the question I want to ask you is how much you believe that a regulated gaming industry is a helpful institution. But I'll ask you the question this way, which is, if the industry didn't exist at all in Australia today, how would the recommendations that came out of your committee look any different? is there a different vision for what you would hope that the industry would look like? And I get that that's a very broad question. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more so you can think about the question while I'm talking. But
can I ask, do you mean if the industry was essentially starting up today and we were regulating it from the ground up before it existed? Is that what you mean? That's
right. If there wasn't the debt of the existing institutions there. I remember one time I had a conversation with a politician from Mississippi, and this was many years ago, and I was asking him about whether he thought that there would ever be online casinos in Mississippi. And he said, if the laws weren't already on the books, we wouldn't even have land-based casinos today. So, what I'm really curious about is your views on whether you think that a regulated market would be the most effective mechanism to sort of optimize the way that gambling exists in society. And if that structure looks a lot different from what you actually have to deal with today because of, the decades of institutional buildup that exists within the gambling industry as a whole and its stakeholders.
Yeah. So while I'm personally a little bit skeptical at the suggestion if you regulate online gambling better in Australia, everyone will just become an expert at accessing illegal gambling sites. I do also subscribe, like I've done on the issue of drugs and illicit drugs, that it's pretty hard to ban things out of existence. Humans are humans, I don't think if we just prohibited gambling that would solve the problem. There would be illegal gambling dens and all the rest of it. So there's that. There is also, to go back an earlier question you had, there is also that thing about people having the right to do what they want to do, even if it hurts them. And at what point it's the government's obligation to step in and try to say, well, no, you don't have control over all the hurt or the harm that you may experience. And also we want to protect young people from going on and experiencing that harm. So there's that as a preamble while I'm still thinking. But also, I think that if we were starting from scratch, we wouldn't have to make a lot of the recommendations, because if we knew 10 years ago, let alone 15 years ago, what the online betting market would look like now, we could have put in place things to stop it, the worst parts of it looking like it looks like.
That's an interesting perspective. I'm asking you all the hard questions that originally attracted me to this industry, because on some level, they don't have a precise answer. So I appreciate you going through the effort of this thought exercise.
I think they're really good questions, and I think they're important questions. And there's been a couple of questions you both have asked me that tempt me to go off on my tangent about government and better why we need better politics. And I've been trying hard not to do that, because that's not the point of this webinar. But the nature of politics all around the world, in recent times at least, has acted against the capacity of governments or parliaments to think medium term or long term, to be proactive in addressing the big challenges, be they social or environmental or financial, and to make decisions that might not please lobbyists or stakeholders, but are for the greater good. And that's one of the problems, I think, the way democracies have been affected by a whole bunch of stuff, this century at least. You mentioned the power of lobbyists. something Sally said, I can't remember now, but it'll come to me, made me think of it as well. And look, I think this is one of those areas, and partly I think we should give ourselves a little bit of a free pass because technology and the nature of society has changed so much so swiftly. It actually is pretty hard to have 10 or 15 years ago anyone could have predicted what the world would be now. So in some respects, it's a bit of an unfair thought exercise. But too often, I think we don't even have the opportunity to try to do it.
And that's the interesting part, that this report has these recommendations. So there is a direct opportunity for the government to make changes. And we do have some interesting roadmaps, because some countries are, or some jurisdictions are, regulating internet gambling for the first time. So the Netherlands just put out a report this week, and they've cited other jurisdictions. So they've specifically said, we're just going to do basically what Germany's doing in terms of spending caps. And we're going to look at Italy's policy on advertising, and we're going to look at what Belgium's doing on, other things. So there are other jurisdictions that have made changes that we can learn from. And specifically spending caps is something, someone emailed a question to me about spending caps and whether that was ever considered, because it is something around affordability and, obviously balancing personal freedoms, but it has been implemented in multiple jurisdictions without any, the consequences being too severe. Yes, some people will switch or go to an offshore site, but it's not necessarily everyone will do so. And there's a lot of people who would really benefit from spending caps, not only from the practicalities, but also from the anchor and the social messaging that sends that this is how much you should be spending on gambling, and this is what the government is recommending.
So, Sally, we did have some evidence about other jurisdictions and about spending caps, and that is something that we looked at. We, as a committee, didn't feel that we had enough evidence about how it was working in Germany, how successful it was. And same with some of the other things that Spain and Italy had, like data vaults and other things. We were quite attracted to it. And we didn't want to be seen to be taking the easy way out. But one of the benefits of other jurisdictions implementing things is that we can actually say, let's have a look at what's going on there while we're bringing in other reforms that are necessary. Let's monitor what's happening with these new approaches in other jurisdictions to see whether or not they're working and whether they can be applied in Australia. We did wonder, and I wonder, about societal differences between Germany and Australia, with people being willing to accept the government telling them how much they can spend. As you know, we have voluntary spending caps and betting limits that people can set for themselves in Australia, with all the questions about how effective that is. But I think there is a live question about whether Australians would accept one step further and the government saying this is how much you can spend. But again, we have the benefit of just seeing what impact it has in Germany and how it works.
Is there any recommendation that you were most excited about that you think is going to be most helpful for addressing all these issues?
Yes and no. I mean, one of the things we tried very hard to do was put together a package of recommendations and sort of say, this is, we took a comprehensive look, and this is a comprehensive way of addressing the harms. And one of our criticisms has been a little bit, the regulations have been a bit too hit and miss, and sometimes just taking the lowest hanging fruit and not having a comprehensive approach. So when the legislation was introduced, not banning ads on television, but reducing the hours on which they could be shown, and saying not during live sport, apart from some loopholes, the consequences of that wasn't actually less ads, it was more ads in different times. And you can't have an ad for betting within 5 minutes of kickoff of a live sporting program, but the broadcast starts half an hour before kickoff. So there's 25 minutes in there where you can pack ads in, right? So that was sort of an unintended consequence of a piecemeal reform. So that's the no. On the yes, there's a recommendation in there that hasn't got much attention, which is putting a duty of care on online bookmakers for customers. And I think that could have a profound effect, not only in the way online bookmakers would be mandated to act, and they give a lot of evidence to say that they are trying very hard to identify people who are experiencing harm and to put procedures in place to make sure that doesn't happen. But that's all voluntary and not regulated. And I think if there was a duty of care, you would see more of that. I also think it would be of assistance when somebody gets themselves in such harm that they're stealing money and other things to be able to gamble and then get themselves in the criminal justice system. If there was a duty of care on the gambling company that they could point to about whether or not that had been upheld, particularly as their gambling increased.
And so just to clarify,
where that money could come from.
The duty of care would be an obligation on the part of the operator to assist if they perceive that there may be issues, and it creates a legal liability if they don't do so. Is that the right way to frame that? And so then potentially it aligns incentives because there's a possibility of litigation and there's different obligations that exist there, which prior to that was all just a voluntary system.
Yeah, it was all voluntary. And we have a situation in the moment, and as a former criminal defence barrister, I absolutely understand why the law does this. And we didn't recommend it changing. But if I'm an accountant by profession, and I become addicted to gambling, and I steal money from my clients in order to gamble, I get prosecuted, rightly so, for the theft. I have some liability to try to pay that money back. The gambling company has no liability for not identifying that I was, on an income of 200 grand a year betting $2 million a year. And how could I possibly afford that? The impact on me, and no liability for the fact that they didn't stop that happening, and it led to my clients being millions and millions of dollars out of pocket. And those people have no recourse either.
We're coming up to the end, and I want to give you an opportunity to have any final comments. But I quickly will then ask, there have obviously been a lot of reactions to the report. I'm wondering if there's been any particular reactions that you'd want to comment on, or anything that's been unexpected following the release of the report. Not really unexpected. I mean, there was a lot of attention to it, and in the community, at least, a lot of support and a lot of, this is what we need. There's a long process to go. So now the stakeholders are lobbying the government about whether or not to adopt the recommendations, and if they do, how to implement them. I think that the government has shown very positive indications of wanting to do more in this space, and welcoming the recommendations, and I'm encouraging them to act. So I think one of the interesting things is I'm a bit disappointed at the major sporting codes, some who don't have any relationship with gambling companies at the moment, maintaining a formal position that that nothing should change, and it's all okay, and that income is important.
while at the same time, some of the clubs that play in the leagues, and certainly a lot of the people that they say they want to spend money on, which are the kids and the mums and dads in the community leagues, are saying, we want change. So I've been a bit surprised about how implacable some of the sporting codes are. And I think they're going to be forced to reevaluate their relationship with gambling companies, whether they're forced to do that by government or forced to do it by community sentiment and the clubs that they that play in their leagues anyway.
Yeah, that's really, there's a lot of stakeholders, as you say, that are involved and have become entrenched in gambling in online gambling, particularly in a very short period of time. Well, look, I want to really thank you so much. It's been so fascinating. We could easily talk to you for much longer about the ins and outs. There's many things we didn't comment on. So I did want to give you the opportunity, if there is anything we didn't specifically ask you that you wanted to mention in terms of the report, its process, or any of the recommendations.
No, Sally, I think I've said enough. As you said, we could talk about this all day. I almost took us down the pathway of reforming democracy, my other little hobby horse. But no, look, it's important work that you all do. It is about trying to make sure that we have the sort of community where people feel that they can make their own choice about how they live their lives, but also we're not empowering industries or activities that cause more harm than good. And that's where, for me, that's where it comes down to the balance between harm and good, and wanting, an obligation on government to minimise the harm.
Well, I think you've just very perfectly summarised what I think most of us are actively working towards in our everyday roles. And what the report has done, and the inquiry, more to the point, did allow a voice for all the people who are working on this, and to have a view, whether it's the mums, the dads, the people involved, or the researchers and different stakeholders. So thank you on behalf of all those stakeholders for giving us a platform to put forward and publish our perspective. So I want to really thank you for your generosity in sharing your time and all your work you put into the inquiry and the report. I'm sure there was some really, really difficult decisions and a lot of work involved from you personally. So thank you very much, and obviously for your generosity in the time today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank both of you for having me on. And Kahlil, I'm sorry I implied you were American. My Canadian brother-in-law will be very angry with me that I didn't pick your accent properly.
Most Canadians would be deeply insulted, but I don't mind. I don't mind at all. Thank you so much for coming on. That was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. We'll have to have you back for the Reforming Democracy conversation, which we will schedule as an 8-hour seminar. But until then, thank you very much. And thank you, Sally, as well as everybody at the Brain and Mind Center, Alex, Oksana, Harrison. Next week, we are again back, and we will be joined by Fred Steinmetz, who's the co-founder and a researcher at the Blockchain Research Lab in Hamburg, Germany. He'll be talking about the relationship between cryptocurrencies and gambling. It will be a very interesting session, and one that you do not want to miss. So, but that's it for this week. So on the behalf of Sally and myself, thank you so much for joining us.